Hi everybody, what's going on? Welcome to Sit Down. I'm DJ Sixsmith, hanging out with Savannah Knoop. Savannah, it's great to have you in. How are you?
Good to be here.
So I watched JT LeRoy this morning, last night.
All right.
Wild movie, wild story. So what'd you think about a movie being made about a really crazy part of your life?
I mean, I've been so involved in the process that we've been working on it for 10 years on the script and, you know, all of the different moving parts of it. But so in some ways, it's just one step in front of the other. And then, you know, in other ways, you're like, God, I can't believe it finally came together. And it's pretty surreal after all this time.
Yeah, I bet.
And it's, you know, it's sort of a story, it's a chapter, it's almost 20 years ago that this
late 90s, early 2000s
slice of life happened. So, yeah, it's interesting to have so much sort of retrospective on it and distance.
And obviously you lived it, you've been living this whole script process too, but just to have that separation from it, I'm sure it's nice for you to just kind of fully put things into perspective. So once you did see the finished product of the movie, were there new things you thought about with the story, or just were there other things you really focused and emphasized on?
I mean, yeah, I think it has been sort of illuminating, and it is also about that process of sort of going way out and looking at it from afar, thinking about the characters as their own sort of separate, sort of, you know, you are writing from whatever the space of, you are sort of standing above it, looking at all the dynamics happening, and that distance does create a sort of new understanding, and because of the films, because it's a different form from writing, I wrote a memoir that we adapted. So I wrote, from having this experience, I wrote a memoir sort of shortly after it had all been unveiled, and wrote it from memory. I didn't have any notes, so that was a sort of translation of form where you look back and go, what happened?
How
did this happen? And then in turn, adapting the book into the film, that's a whole other translation process because it's such a visual and such a sort of compressed time form. And so in some ways, you know, a lot of things, there'd be a lot of moments that were teased out in real time very slowly, but then get, like, one moment becomes a placeholder for many moments, and it becomes a kind of crystallized, compressed, you know, the volume's up all the way on it.
Yeah.
So in some ways that was really illuminating to the process because you're kind of looking at all the themes and you get to distinguish them because the volume's up on each one of them.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And when I watch the movie and I see Kristen Stewart going through this whole emotional journey, which must have been really interesting for you because it's like at that point in your life, you're trying to figure out who you are.
Right.
Then you are being this other person and living that life for many, many years. How did you balance the whole thing? I mean, you know, just can you kind of give me a snapshot of emotionally what life was like for you at that point?
So in watching Kristen, it was really interesting. One part that was really illuminating for me was seeing how separate these two, the Savannah character and then the JT character, are completely different sort of embodiments. Like she plays them completely different, and sort of, it seems maybe obvious now, but in looking back on the process, it felt very blurry to me.
I'm sure it did.
I mean, that's sort of the
natural.
meat of the product. It's like, it just starts superimposing.
Right, you can't tell one without the other.
Which
or the
one
difference.
is,
who am I today or who am I later on today?
Yeah.
It gets confusing.
And what do you owe to each? And, and in so I was about 18 going on 19 when it all started. I was in community college in San Francisco, which is such an amazing place. And we had a whole, that was part of the whole story trajectory, which we cut out the school completely from the script, sort of a week into
There's only so much you can pack in 2 hours.
It was just about logistics, but also it's sort of like, well, maybe we can get what we need in, I mean, it's this perfect marriage of logistics and does the story need it? Can we put it in a more compressed way?
That would have been interesting to the story, but at the same time you kind of get the vibe of, okay, here's this 18-year-old just moving to San Francisco,
working
kid, trying to find themselves, you know, it's like, okay, but then what's going on here is even more interesting. So yeah, the school thing would have been cool, but I'm sure as you kind of saw things emotionally happening, you're like, okay, they hit what I was feeling there.
Yeah, and what it did end up serving the story in that, so that was one play, you know, you'd have multiple scenes at school. You had a few at your waiting tables gig.
Right.
You had Laura's studio and you had Savannah's studio, and that's where most of the story plays out. And in some ways, taking out a lot of the exteriors or anything that, like the school would have been like shots outside, maybe you're walking around. It became very almost claustrophobic, the experience, and I think emotionally that actually really serves the story because you have that push and pull, and there isn't much room. You're either you're in your house, you're in your place, you're in their place, and when you're out in the world, you're only JT. That's sort of what we boiled it down to.
Yeah.
So that's like kind of a perfect example.
Yeah, and almost like with the music and the lighting, it did really feel claustrophobic because I was watching it, I'm like, I kind of feel anxious now watching it, you know? And like, I don't get anxious watching movies, but I don't know, I just imagine it, as you're balancing those two lives, that it does feel a little claustrophobic and it does feel a little anxious. So the character in the movie, it seems like there are just certain points when they're like, I'm done with this. I don't want to do it anymore.
Definitely.
When did you hit those points, and how did you keep going on with the whole thing?
So those points I did hit probably so many more times.
I'm sure, yeah.
But in some ways it serves as to me, from the outside it looks like a sort of traditional Hollywood trajectory, but I think in the storyline, there's a lot of, that's where it becomes almost experimental. You feel the duration of this 6-year experience through the stops, the starts, the stops, the starts.
Yeah.
There's maybe 2 or 3 even. And yeah, I mean, I think it is about getting into the sort of emotional desires of the Savannah character that would keep this person doing it over and over for so many years.
Right.
Because not everyone would, maybe, but also maybe it's easy enough to identify with the sort of ride, the casualness of the ride. You jump on, it's like, yeah, sure, why not?
I mean, yeah, it's a ride, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Because you think about your life, I mean, 18-year-old kid just doing your thing. All of a sudden, as JT, like, you're going everywhere, you become the center of attention.
Right.
As a person that's exploring your identity, you get to do that as well. So what did JT allow you to do that you felt like you couldn't do in your own life?
So I think it was sort of, there was this, I think at the time I was, you know, you are sort of like, why am I here on this green earth? You know, that you are going through that as a young person.
Things, yeah, especially at that point in your life.
And it's, you know, and if you have the joy of realizing that you are maybe going towards a creative path, it's like, it takes a while to peel off the Band-Aid sometimes.
Yeah.
But in the JT land, so it's like you'd go into JT land and get to be an artist. You didn't even have to do the work. You got to just be there after all the work's done.
Right?
That's the hard part, you know?
Yeah, the stories were written. You know, the books
stories were written, and then also living in a queer body, which of course was not something new, but it is sort of, you can be invested in it because it's not your life, and you can also take some room.
Sure.
You know, it's kind of both at the same time, invested and not.
Right.
And so that I think was a big part of it, even though I think you do get the sense in the film that it's never a totally comfortable experience, but it is sort of, I don't know, giving this character enough, like you're kind of always doing the moral calculus and also the emotional calculus.
Sure, yeah. You know, I'm watching this and I'm just wondering how this plays out in the social media era with everything.
For sure.
Because it was like very early internet, and of course people do kind of put the pieces together to figure out, wait a minute, you know, there's this picture of Savannah, this is JT, this is who this actually is.
But very slow.
Very slow. I mean, it took, what, 5-6 years? More?
It was on monkeybrains.net or something. There's only one picture when you Googled my name.
That's crazy.
And it was, people were just starting to get smartphones, but not many people had them. I think it was like right at the end. And I had a flip phone sort of halfway through. So
gotcha.
We didn't have social media in the same way. It is sort of it's like a lot of the themes of living a sort of full social media cyborg existence.
Yeah, seriously.
But right before it struck.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that. I mean, you think about Second Life, for example.
Totally.
And you can just
Total
be a different person, right? You were just doing that in real life.
Except that also it's like the avatar, it's in the real world. In the real world, your avatar is another person.
Right.
You know, so I'm playing the JT avatar for Laura. JT is my avatar.
Yeah, there's so many different people.
So everyone's sort of, there's not enough room. There's a triangulation of everyone's sort of crowding into my body, and what's the threshold of that between Laura needing what she is trying to get out of this experience, JT, who's a fictional character, but also does sort of have, I don't know, his own legs in terms of the fiction that's created around his life, and myself, and then we're all living also in the JT entity. And so it's kind of like things get really messy when there's not enough space.
Definitely. And now that you've had some time removed from it, just as Savannah, you know, how do you describe and just kind of bring everything in now? Because there's obviously some great things that happen for you in terms of finding out who you are. You had these amazing experiences. There's also people that get hurt along the way as a result of this whole thing. So how do you wrap all that in your head when you think about it now?
I mean, partly I think there's, it's sort of about, I think, this writing practice. Laura's practice was about writing off the page, writing on the page, and then you'd write off the page in the real world. And what happens when you start to sort of play with writing off the page and you have this person play your character, it's a fictional character. What's the harm in that? But then as you go along for many years, what are the effects for me personally, what were the effects for me, for everyone that we encountered on an interpersonal level? And I think the film also centers on what are the effects between these two people in their sort of relationship, which is a creative relationship, but is also full of power dynamics and sort of struggle. And I think it is in the feminism of this film that it's not a catfight, and one person's narrative isn't in opposition to another, and one person's perspective doesn't negate another, but there's a lot of struggle between the characters regardless.
Yeah, no question about it.
And personally, at this point, it's like I just try to, interpersonally, it's very direct. Like all the complications, I try to just avoid that sort of.
Well, there's a lot of gray areas to it.
There's a lot of gray area, and I think the film is sort of about like, what are the gray areas that are okay, and what sort of starts to mess with you and everyone around you.
Yeah, and I think at this point in 2019, it's like, let's just lay it all on the table. It's like, you lived this way, you were JT, and people can make their own judgment. But at the same time, it's like, let's just unpack all the different elements to it, because it's very easy to put your story in a box and say, you pretended to be somebody, you lied to people, but there's so much more to that story. And I think this movie, when people watch it, will really understand that. And I'm sure after 10 years of work, you really hoped that that would come out to screen, which I really think it did.
I'm so glad. Yeah, I do think it's about that, you know, we're sort of trying to lay out the facts, the emotions, and then the sort of like emotional facts, which are
a different thing in and of itself.
They're all separate, but also to tell it in a non-judgmental way. It's not a process of convincing your audience. It's sort of leaving people to their own conclusions, and everyone is free to have an opinion about it. And you know, it's about, in some ways, it was easy to put this story into a box, and it was in the media a lot throughout the years. But in another way, it didn't really make sense. The logic of it didn't make sense because it was too complicated to fit in a short form, in my opinion.
I 100% agree with you.
So it is sort of about that translation of form again. And to me, like, that sort of is our job as artists and storytellers, is to get at the complexities and nuances of human experience, because the role of propaganda is amply filled in this day.
Yeah, definitely. So what's life like for you now, not having JT and Savannah? It's just Savannah.
It's just Savannah.
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's good. It's good. It feels good. And I've lived in New York 10 years.
That's awesome.
Love it. So happy to be here.
Good spot to be.
Make art. I write. I do performance. I mean, I feel like I've inhabited all of the things that maybe I started out with as JT, but in such a more, again, direct way. And it feels great.
Yeah. Do you still think about JT every day?
I don't. I mean, except when I'm doing press for our
but
film.
But like, how long did it take to like fully separate?
I think it took a few years.
I'm sure it did.
Yeah.
I mean, you lived that way for a few years. You really needed time to just say like, what happened?
Right.
And then who am I going to be going forward?
And I'm very grateful that I wrote the book when I did and from memory, because I feel like at this point, I actually don't remember that much of it. And it serves as this record of the sort of raw emotions laid out. And, but I do feel like it was an important sort of moment of processing the experience.
Yeah, no question about it.
Yeah.
Well, Savannah, it's been great meeting you.
Great meeting you.
Thank you very much for coming in. I will promise you people, when you check this movie out, there's a lot of things to think about and you won't be disappointed. JT LeRoy, you guys can catch it in theaters now. All right, everybody, we'll see you next time here on The Sit Down.
Bye, thanks.